Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm your host, Levi Rickert, founder, editor of Native News Online. All month long, we have been at Native News Online commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, also known as the Snyder Act. With us today, we have a very special guest, somebody who I admire, Assemblyman James C. Ramos from California. Welcome, Assemblyman. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm happy you are here. Hey, we're going to talk about the Indian Citizenship Act, and I guess I'm going to ask you this question I've been asking people all month long. What word best describes this 100th anniversary of the Snyder Act? Commemoration, observation, reflection, or celebration?
Reflection.
Tell us why you say reflection.
Is reflecting on the past history towards our people, those that during times of colonization, especially here in the state of California, wasn't a welcoming, right? There was a big push to exterminate. There was a push to pay for militias to rid not only the state of California, but this nation of the first people. And then you have this act that comes through in 1924. So it is a reflection. It's a reflection of the past treatment, the atrocity towards our people. And then the government, the federal government says, well, in 1924, we'll pass an act that gives you Citizenship Act. But when you read the act in its entirety, it doesn't grant Indian people full Citizenship Act. It puts out parameters for it. So it's a reflection in my mind.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And there are some states in this union that did not allow Native Americans to vote. And I think Utah was one of the last ones in 1957. And they were basically court ordered so that people who are Native American in 1958 could, in fact, vote. Let me ask you this, and we're in an election year, and not to get overly partisan, but do Native Americans, in your opinion, still face a certain amount of voter suppression?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, here in the state of California, I passed a bill, one of my first bills that I passed, to look at the different roadblocks to the Native American people and the right to vote. Here we have Indian reservations that are close to proximity to some areas and counties that could get to the voting polls quickly. But then there's other Indian reservations that are so rural that the voting doesn't even reach them as far as the information, the ballots, those types of things. So there still is barriers to continually affecting our people. It's something that needs to be looked at and adhered to.
Well, thank you for that answer. And in the climate back in the 1920s, and then during World War I, some 12,500 Native Americans actually fought in the U.S. Armed Forces on behalf of the U.S. government. They were not citizens. So Congressman Snyder felt, hey, let's pass this Citizenship Act. Why do you think Native Americans have, dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War, been willing to fight on behalf of the U.S. government, even when they were not citizens?
I think it lies into our culture and our ancestry of the ground that we grew up culturally knowing, right? And so to me, when you're going out and defending this country, you're defending the land that our ancestors are the traditional keepers of the land. That's why, per capita wise, I believe there's more Native Americans that sign up when wars come forward, or even in the military in general, per capita wise, because we view this area and this land as still our traditional land, our land to be able to protect. And then the recognition for those that served in the World War to get Citizenship Act. We're fighting for our own country and to make sure that we're protecting our cultural resources, our ancestors, and their resiliency to overcome what they've kind of overcame here in history to be able to be here today, right? Myself here in California as the only serving California Indian in the state's history in the state legislature. And that story resonates to many Native American people throughout the United States. That's that resiliency and the voices of our ancestors that continues to move forward through us.
Yes, and even today, 100 years after President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act on June 2nd, 1924, there are still some tribes, particularly out east, that feel calling themselves U.S. citizens. When they do that, if they do that, they are eroding the concept of tribal sovereignty. Tell us what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I think now we deal with the term federally recognized tribes that have been federally recognized by the federal government. I certainly, with the act that moved forward in 1924, Indian Citizenship Act, some didn't even have the right to vote in some states as late as the late 60s, right? And so there still is barriers that are going up. So when you look at an oppressed government that tried to annihilate our people, put us on Indian reservations, and then gives a stamp of approval of federal recognition, it's something that we hold on to because it's a thread to be able to move forward, our tribe move forward in gaming, but there's a lot more in our cultural aspect that still needs to be told throughout the United States. So how can we be called Dual Citizenship Act when our people were the original people of this land? And so there is at least some education that needs to be done throughout the United States and here in the state of California on why there is some differing opinions of that. And I don't think it should be the government that tells that story or tries to educate. It should come from the Indian people themselves of telling why that feeling is there and educate the community and even our own community on why there is that opinion that still resonates today. But it should come from the Indian people themselves on that educational process.
Mm-hmm. And just today, I was in a meeting here in Minnesota, and there's a young man who's doing some voter advocacy work in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and they were asked. He went out and asked some citizens, tribal citizens, why they voted, and it came down to because my grandma, my auntie told me, my cousin told me, and I thought that was so interesting. What do you say to Native Americans who sometimes are really reluctant to vote? Because I know I've gotten that pushback, and I've had people ask me in the past, how can you even vote in the white man's election? What do you tell Native citizens? And I like what you said. It's incumbent on us to educate our Native people. Indians should educate other Native people about why it's important.
It's real important for us to not only vote, but run for the political offices in our local areas, in our traditional homelands, to be that voice of the impact that continues to affect our people with water rights, domestic violence, public safety, those issues that have been plaguing our people, education attainment, right? Way before gaming came. These are issues that if the political system is moving forward in your area and there's an opportunity, I think we need to be part of that. We're dealing with now in 2024 of being a voice to address these issues that have plagued our people, not just the last 10 years, but for generations. It has plagued our people. So I push as many people that want to learn about how we got into the political system to get more Native Americans involved in the political system, because then you are that voice that's determining land use issues when it deals with water. You are that voice when it deals with public safety, of domestic violence, of fentanyl on our Indian reservations, when we deal with mental health components. Why is Native Americans the highest statistic here in the state of California and the nation? We need to have people on those boards to make sure we're getting resources to our people. So it's important to be ingrained in the political system. It's time that we start to have that voice in those areas, because if we're not at the table as the decision maker, someone else is making that decision for us. I think it's time for us to be at that table and make those decisions for ourselves.
Yes, I would agree with that. And so I take it from your answer that you really do endorse the whole idea of dual citizenship, which I know I do. So,
Oh yeah, I think it's something that we have to deal with, right? We have to deal
yes.
with how do we be that voice now in 2024, 2026, 2030, 2040, 2050, right? To start to change those issues. We've been in the state legislature now since 2018, and we've pushed pieces of legislation that the governor signed dealing with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And people don't even understand what that is until we start to educate within the legislature. And now we're dealing with Public Law 280, how the state of California is under that Public Law 280, and how public safety on Indian reservations is far, far from being able to protect its own people. And when that law was passed, it wasn't passed to protect Indian people, it was passed to protect the outside community from the marauding Indians that went into the community.
Hmm. Wow. And yeah, I admire the work that you've done, and you mentioned that just in some of your answers, some of the things you've worked on in the state of California, getting it through the legislature. Tell me this: I'm from Michigan, and you know this because you've done legislation around history of Native people, how it's being taught in public education. I was shocked when I read about some of the history of how the Native people were treated in California. Because often, I will say this: when I was younger, my education kind of ended with the Great Plains Indian Wars. Right, that's kind of when we fell off the timeline. And then when I became more of a student of history and really looking at California, there was just people were treated horribly. The Native people out there. Tell me this: what were your ancestors like in 1924? We're talking about the Snyder Act of 1924 when Native Americans became citizens. But what was life like back for your ancestors in your tribe?
In 1924, you had the whole replacing, right? The extermination that happened in the San Bernardino Mountains in 1866. You had forced villages that couldn't go back to traditional ways of collecting plants and free roaming life after that time. So villages were set up, at least in our area, by the National Orange Show grounds now, and then over to another area by Baseline in Victoria where hot springs were at. And in 1891 created the San Manuel Indian Reservation. So our people lived on that reservation in 1891. And then came 1924. It was deep poverty. They were forced to live in a way and in foods that weren't traditional. So there was deep poverty during that time. And people think about the substance and all those different things that we deal with now, substance abuse, those things. When people are taken out of their natural way of life and forced to live a different way on government commodities, on housing, substandard housing, right? And so the mentality starts to dwindle. We've seen in that time in 1924 deep poverty on the Indian reservations. Where here the federal government, USDA, came in and said they'll grant some agricultural trees so that you could learn to be farmers. That didn't work. Then came the U.S. Department of Agriculture bringing in different livestock, right, to be able to fend for yourself. That didn't work. And so people during that time are still adjusting. And I would say that because of that, we're still dealing with that historical trauma and continuing trauma. That's why our people still suffer at the highest mental health components of suicide prevention, those areas that are there, mental health, substance abuse. Alcohol still remains the number one killer of our people, even more than the different illegal drugs that are out there. Alcohol still is the number one killer.
I tell you, as I said earlier, I admire the work you've done. What would you say? And you've been there in the state legislature since what? Would you say 2018?
2018.
What would you say you're the most proud of? Some of your work.
I think we're still working, right? But
Okay.
one of the things that we were able to do was to replace the Junipero Serra statue here on the Capitol grounds. and
Yes.
replaced them with a Miwok Nisenan leader from the grounds that this Capitol stands on, with now that monument in the Capitol ground. And Indian people have been coming and they take pictures next to it, and it gives them a sense of belonging, right? And so that probably is, up to this point, an area of pride, not only for myself, but for Indian people in the state of California, because now there is a monument there of an Indian leader. And it's not so far back. It's only one generation that this Indian leader was there, Bill Franklin, that taught culture and brought it back, the Miwok dancing. And so when you look at history and people think, well, that's so far back, this and no. With our history, it's not even that far back. It's one generation of where we're still capturing and retaining our culture and moving forward. That's a big accomplishment. Another one was changing the name of a university in San Francisco. It was called Hastings Law School. And I brought in the Yuki Indian people, who this Hastings person ended up being one of the first U.S. Superior judges here in the state of California. Paid money, landowner, but he got that money because he paid for militias to go out in a forced extermination against the Yuki Indian people out in Eden Valley, Round Valley. And so I led that debate, carried a bill, and the name no longer is on that university. Hastings is gone. It's called now the law school of San Francisco. But in that bill, we got the law library to be able to be named a Yuki Indian name. And we started to be able to tell that history of their past founder. And that name no longer is associated with that university. Bringing to light the historical treatment that you brought up against California's first people. It's horrendous. During the Spanish colonization brought so much genocide towards our people and atrocities, right? And slavery, those issues that others claim to have those terms into their culture. Slavery, it happened to the California Indian people. California was admitted as a free state, but the slaves that were here was California Indian people from the beginning. And you talk about genocide. There's tribes that were wiped off the earth here in the state of California. And so working with my colleagues of those caucuses to understand that starts to bring that educational component forward. And they became one of our strongest allies in all the plights that we're moving forward.
Well, that is tremendous. And often, and I know Representative Sharice Davis, and she entered the U.S. Congress in 2019 with Deb Haaland, when Deb Haaland was still a congresswoman from state of New Mexico. And she said she and I almost call her Secretary Haaland, but Representative Haaland then, they spent their first year doing Indians 101 with their colleagues. Do you find like you're still doing Indians 101 with your colleagues there in the state legislature?
Definitely. Every bill that we introduce becomes an educational bill. We have Public Law 280 bill where we're trying to get some policing authority to federally recognized tribes because of the MMIW plight here in the state of California, where California is number 5 of all states in the nation of not even investigating those murders. Wow. And so we had hearings on this issue with tribal leaders, and it became apparent that Public Law 280, because of that lack of public policy on Indian reservations and the disconnect between the local jurisdictions, knowing that they have authority to investigate those areas, going back to the creation of PL 280, not to protect our people, but to protect non-Indian people from the Indian people themselves. So we had to go back into a deep roundtable and educational component before my bill was even heard. We brought scholars in from UCLA, and Judge Abbey, who's UROC, came in person that explained and educated the legislature on this issue. We have another bill that deals with educating in K through 12, that when the state of California educates people on the Spanish colonization incursion, that they shall talk about the impact on California's first people. And then when they talk about the gold rush era, that they shall talk about the impact on California's first people. Both of those eras were so destructive to the California Indian people that it needs to be told from the California Indian perspective into the history books. No longer should it be a paternal approach, but it should be the voices of our people leading that discussion of what is being taught in the K through 12s about us.
Yes. And the Governor Gavin Newsom, he was it 3 years ago, thereabouts, he did an apology. What's your working relationship with him, Assemblyman?
On tribal issues, Indian issues, it's great. In 2019, he offered that apology, the first sitting governor to offer apology to California's first people for the horrid treatment towards them. And he brought up the first governor of the state of California put out bounties on the California Indian people and paid militias with state tax dollars to pay those militias to go out and shoot and kill Indian people. That then the legislature at that time sought reimbursement from the federal government to pay for those militias, and it was granted. So first was state dollars, and then reimbursed by the federal government for those killing machines against our people.
Yeah, and that's, I know, as I mentioned a little while ago, when I first read about that, and I was reading about those bounties, I was actually shocked. It was because that really never gets into history, not at least where I was in Michigan. I never learned that in school. So keep up the good work. What's on the horizon? What are you still working on? What's real pressing?
Well, we're still working on making sure that we're moving forward on PL 280, making sure that missing and murdered Indigenous people is not something where the state now moves into number 4 of all states. We're trying to curb that. We continue to work on raising the awareness of issues here in the state of California. Just like we talked about those bounties that were out there. The average person in the state of California doesn't even understand that took place. And then there's a population that doesn't even want to acknowledge that took place against California Indian people. So we're still raising that awareness. The speaker, 2 speakers now under Speaker Rivas, has granted me the California Native American Legislative Caucus, where I'm the only Native American from California Indian people here. So I opened it up to allies, those that have come in, and we quickly have become a large caucus, touching on issues of MMIW, touching on issues of racial slurs used against our people, making sure that regalia at graduation is being done, making sure that public safety through Public Law 280, understanding that and giving that rights back to Indian people is something that now we're moving forward on. And we just uncovered with an audit that the UCs and the Cal State universities harness over 1.4 million remains of our ancestors that have not been repatriated back. Even though it was law back 15, 20 years ago, they have not even moved forward in that. Only 7% was identified that was repatriated back. So we're moving forward on making sure that repatriation process takes place. I'm going to have a hearing coming up probably in September or October to hold those universities accountable, to make sure that another 20 years doesn't go by and we don't put our ancestors back in the ground for a proper reburial. Those are issues that we're still dealing with. And we moved forward to start to lay the groundwork here in the state of California for the first time in the state's history in the month of November for National Native American Heritage Month. We have now secured a date in November to have the first National Native American Heritage Day here in the state of California, a parade honoring California's first people.
Well, that's fantastic, and I'm gonna try to get my way out there. I go to California periodically. I want to come visit you because you are doing it, sir, and I really admire you. And thank you very much, Chi Miigwech. In Potawatomi, Miigwech means thank you. Can you give us the last word?
I think standing up for all of our people, again, if decisions are going to be made about our water, our ancestral territories, we should have a voice at the table. And that means getting engaged in the political system, because our ancestors are still crying out from the grounds here in the state of California, across the nation. Tell them who we truly are as Native American people. Tell them our true story. Tell them about our resiliency to be able to move forward. It's time that we start to honor our ancestors and be that voice at the table.
Thank you, sir. And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Native Bidaské. All month long, Native News Online has been observing the 100th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. And next week, we're actually going to have a special panel. It's going to be our Native reporters who will discuss it. And they're a lot younger than me, so I'm really looking forward to hear what their perspective is on the Indian Citizenship Act. In the meantime, be safe. If you're not registered to vote, get yourself registered so you are ready to go when early voting starts, or certainly for November 5. Chi Miigwech. See you next week.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi Miigwech.